The Hoop Heads Podcast is brought to you by Head Start Basketball.
Hey Hoopheads! Wanted to take a minute to shout out our partners and friends at Dr. Dish Basketball. Their Dr. Dish shooting machines are undoubtedly the most advanced and user-friendly machines on the market, and they truly accelerate skill development faster than ever. Learn more at drdishbasketball.com and follow their incredible content at Dr. Dish B-Ball on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Mention the Hoopheads podcast and save an extra $300 on the Dr. Dish Rebel, All-Star, and CT models. Also, make sure to check out the new Dr. Dish Home Machine, which is perfect for these crazy times when gyms and schools are closed. Visit drdishbasketball.com for details. That's a great deal, Hoopheads. Get your Dr. Dish shooting machine today.
Hi, this is Jonathan Sippis, head women's basketball coach at the University of Wisconsin, and you're listening to the Hoop Heads Podcast.
Hey Hoopheads, we all hate ankle sprains, and they happen way too often. Ankle injuries are the number one sports-related injury. Arise is trying to change that. With the iFast, your athletes get preventative protection and full mobility. Athletes no longer need to wear bulky braces that limit performance and give mediocre protection. Anyone playing sports should be using these products. Keep your athletes in the game. Don't wait for them to get hurt to take action. Visit www.arise.com, spelled A-R-Y-S-E, and use the code HOOPHEADS to get 20% off the future of performance. That's ARYSE.com with promo code HOOPHEADS to get 20% off.
I always love watching coaches after a championship and watch how much they credit their guys versus how much they talk about themselves.
Brian Levenson is the founder of Strong Skills, which provides executive and mental performance coaching, speaking, and consulting to elite organizations, performers, and leaders. Brian has been fortunate to work with CEOs, professional athletes, teams in the NBA, NHL, MLS, Division I athletic departments, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Homeland Security, Hilton, the Young Presidents Organization, and many others. Brian also has a weekly podcast, Intentional Performers, where he interviews a diverse set of elite high performers. His new book, Shift Your Mind, is now available for purchase on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever you find your books. Don't miss our free Hoopheads Pod webinar series on Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. If you miss a live webinar, you can buy lifetime access to any of our previous webinars for $4.99 on the Hoopheads Pod website. If you're focused on improving your coaching and your team, we've got you covered. Visit hoopheadspod.com/webinars to get registered. Make sure you check out our new Hoopheads Pod network of shows, including Thrive with Trevor Huffman, Beyond the Ball, the CoachMaze.com podcast, Players Court, Bleachers and Boards, and our team-focused NBA podcasts, Cavaliers Central, Grizz and Grind, Nuck If You Buck, the 305 Culture Miami Heat podcast, and Blazing the Path. We're looking for more NBA podcasters interested in hosting their own shows centered on a particular team. Shoot an email to info@hoopheadspod.com if you're interested in learning more and bringing your talent to our network. Grab a pen and paper to take some notes as you listen to this episode with Brian Levenson, founder of Strong Skills and the author of the new book, Shift Your Mind. Hello and welcome to the Hoopheads Podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here without my co-host Jason Sunkel this morning, but I am pleased to be joined from Strong Skills mental performance coach Brian Levenson. Brian, welcome to the Hoopheads Pod.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Really excited to be here. I'm a big hoops head, so I'm excited to chat some basketball with you today.
Fantastic. We're excited to have you on and dig into what it takes to be a great mental performer. I want to talk to you first about how you got into this field, what made it interesting to you, and just give us a little bit of your background in terms of athletics and why you ended up in this area.
I was a big sports, fan, athlete growing up. I wasn't as good of an athlete as you are looking over your bio. But I love playing basketball. I love playing soccer, baseball, roller hockey, just like kind of a normal adolescent boy, I guess. And but went to college, didn't play any sports there, and was connected to basketball in some regards. Coached a little bit in college, coached a little bit in high school, and graduated. No clue what I wanted to do when I grew up. Went into sales for a couple of years, and while I was in sales, I had lunch one day with a woman named Julie Ellion. And Julie, at the time, was a mental performance coach. She was working with a lot of the top golfers in the world. She was working with Phil Mickelson at the time, and worked with other athletes as well. And we had lunch, and it was one of those lunches that just flowed. It was easy. What she was talking about made sense. And she sort of looked at me and said, look, I think this is a growing field. I think you'd enjoy it. I think you'd be good at it. And so I'm happy to mentor you and help you. And I left that lunch and said, okay, it's great. I'm not that interested in going back to school right now. I spent my whole life in school. So stayed in sales for a little bit and then circled back with Julie and said, look, I think this combines two things that I know that I'm passionate about: sports, which a lot of people are passionate about. Okay, cool. But helping people. And that was a psychology piece. And so at the time, I always said I wouldn't have gotten into psychology if it didn't have a sports component. And then I always say I wouldn't have gotten into sports if it didn't have a psychology component. So the blending of the two was really exciting to me. And so I went to grad school. I got my master's in sports psychology. And when I finished that up, I was fortunate to get to move back to Washington, D.C., work alongside Julie. She mentored me for about a year and a half. We collaborated on some cool stuff. And then she said, hey, Brian, do you think you want to just do your own thing? And I said, yeah. And so here I am. So I've been doing this work for almost a decade now, and just love helping people get from where they are to where they want to go. It started in sports. I still work with a lot of athletes and sports teams, but it's also morphed into working with people outside of sport as well. So that's, I guess, my story, my background. Fortunate to find something that I was good at and that I love to do at a relatively young age.
What did that mentorship mean to you, especially when you think about your work with other people? How much do you recommend to them or talk to them about the need to find a mentor? Because I think that's something that a lot of times people may discount how important that can be in terms of setting you on the right path and helping you to see where the obstacles in the road might be. So just talk a little bit about what mentorship meant to you, and then maybe how you utilize that in your practice with whether it's business people or athletes.
It's a great question. For me, the people that I graduated from grad school with, we just had a reunion a couple of weeks ago. And I felt so privileged, and I'm going to use that word. I know it's a loaded term that has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people, but I absolutely was privileged to have Julie as a mentor. When I finished grad school, I was in training camp with an NBA team pretty quickly. I had a pro basketball player that I was working with. I had a pro golfer that I was working with. So for me, it was a complete unfair advantage that I had to start my career. And that's why I'm always hesitant to talk about my journey, because I'm not hesitant to talk about it, but I want to acknowledge the fact that because of Julie, I had a leg up, like an absolute leg up. And that's just on like the business side of it and actually having clients and getting to do the work. Even more so, I got to learn what she did, how she did it. I also got to learn what things maybe I didn't want to do that she did do, and how she operated, and maybe learn from some of her mistakes. So I think we think of a mentor as somebody that gives us advice on the path that they've been on because we want to walk in those shoes and we want to go in a similar path. But I think a great mentor will also show you the dark side of what they do and some of the negatives that come with it. So Julie traveled a ton for her work. She was basically on the PGA Tour and then had clients outside of the PGA Tour. And I just never wanted to do that. And I never had a desire to do that. And I could see her getting really tired, just traveling nonstop, working nonstop. And so I've tried to set up my business and what I do a little bit differently. So the last thing I'll say on mentorship is I think people now think, oh, I'm going to go make you my mentor, or ask somebody, hey, will you be my mentor? And I think like anything in life, when I was in sales, it was always about building relationships with people. And I think if you build a relationship with someone, it'll be more organic and you can listen because they'll make offers. Like people will make offers. People love to help other people. I think that's innate in our society. People are also selfish, but people love to help others and to share what they've learned. And so I've had a number of mentors along the way, and some are more formal, some are informal, some I've known, some I've just called a mentor from afar. Like I listen to their podcast or I read their book and they're now my mentor. So I think we sometimes try to make it so formal. And what I've found is that if you listen and there's an offer on the table, say yes, take them up on it, follow through, say thank you, show your appreciation, and those people will want to do more of it. And I think about my mentors, they're often the ones reaching out to me now and saying, how's it going? And I think they get pride in the work that I'm doing and it is fulfilling for them. So I think it's not a one-way street. I think I now mentor other people, and I'll tell you, like there's at least 2 young men that I think about where I'm quote unquote their mentor. I learned so much from them. They are brilliant people. And so I think the mistake we make is often that we think it's a one-way street. And so, I love talking about mentorship because I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that what you just said there about it being a two-way street is something that if you read books about leadership and you read books about mentorship, you come to the conclusion very quickly that it has to be a two-way street where that flow of information is going both ways. And yes, the mentor is helping the mentee along the way and guiding them and giving them some of their experience. And at the same time, that mentee is giving the mentor a way to look at things maybe a little bit differently or a different perspective. And to me, that's where the real value lies, as opposed to thinking of yourself as being up on a pulpit and saying, hey, this is what you need to do. Instead, it's a conversation. It's an interaction that benefits both parties as opposed to all the benefit flowing one direction. As you said, when you think back to the beginning of your practice and what you were doing, what's something that from the beginning when you started to where you are now, something that you feel like you're better at or something that you've learned along the way that's had a really positive impact on the way you interact with clients?
I'll answer that question, but one last riff on the two-way street piece.
Sure.
Isn't that kind of everything? Like, isn't...
should be, right? Should be.
It should be. Right? So if you think about a coach and a basketball player, it should be a two-way street. And we talk about servant leadership and this idea of, always serving your players. Well, coaches want to win basketball games and coaches want to have a job and coaches want to be able to do what they're doing. And depending on what level you're at, there are different value systems to what jobs might entail. But at my company, Strong Skills, we talk about that we invest in our people, in our clients. They invest their time and energy into the coaching and training process. And then together, we hopefully create a paradigm shift that moves us from what we call soft skills in the corporate world to strong skills. So the reason I brought that up is just this idea of collaboration. And I think too often we think that it's a one-way street and then you have a power dynamic that doesn't free everybody up to grow. And my favorite moments in basketball are when Tony Parker takes the clipboard from Greg Popovich and is now running plays in the huddle, or you see a point guard come to the sideline and point something out to their coach and they have a dialogue. It's a two-way street. And I've been around basketball at the high school, college, and pro level. And at every single one of those levels, the coaches that have players that are involved, that ask questions, that are engaged, those are the best relationships. So I understand that titles can cause us to think that there is a power dynamic, and there is, especially when there's playing time in basketball. But I just think it's important for people to remember that if you are the mentee, your job is also to challenge the mentor. Your job is also to push them, to hold them accountable, to make it a worthwhile time investment, because everybody invests their time and time's our most valuable resource. And so as I was hearing you talk, I think it's so important that we are always thinking that way. Once again, when I worked in sales, it wasn't a one-way street. I had to provide value for my clients. if I was going to sell them a good. And if I wasn't creating a good experience for them, they weren't going to work with me anymore. And I think a coach is no different. You have to provide value to your athletes. And that's not just basketball. That's also life. There's a lot of different ways to pour into someone's life. And then it goes back and forth. And when that marriage is broken or torn, or the trust or the communication or the respect is not there, then you get a divorce. And there's nothing wrong with divorces. Like, when you're not happy, you should transfer. You should, stop seeing somebody. But to me, the issue in relationships, and this could be a marriage or a coach and a player, is when there isn't a mutual respect, when there isn't communication, and when there isn't trust. And so I just think that that's really important when you think about the mentor-mentee component in relationship to what you were asking, and the idea of what have I learned. When I was in grad school, they were really big on trying to help me understand this idea that I don't have to have all the answers, and a great question is often more powerful than a great answer. And at the time, I was learning all these mental skills like visualization and self-talk and goal setting and breathing. And I was so geeked up about this stuff that I wanted to share it with the world. And so for a lot of my athletes that I worked with, I want to just give them these tools. And so I think one of the things that's changed for me is that when I'm working with youth athletes, a lot of times my job is to teach them the how and really help them get those tools and skills. But when I'm working with college athletes or pro athletes or, people that are in the corporate world and are adults, a lot of times my job is to ask them great questions and have them come up with solutions. So I think that's something I wasn't aware of when I was younger. I just kind of took a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think today I try to figure out when to ask a great question, when to provide a tool, and to understand where those can add value to people, and to really listen deeply. And oftentimes a question can be super, super powerful to unlocking someone's potential.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think actually both answers to the last two questions that you shared, I think go hand in hand, in the sense that when I think about how coaching basketball or coaching sports in general has changed over the last, let's say, 35 years, you go back maybe to the Bobby Knight school of basketball coaching, where it was, this is what we're going to do. You're going to do it. You're not going to question my authority at all. You're not going to have any input into what we do. This is just what we do. And there isn't that back and forth, that flow of, I don't think Bobby Knight very often was handing over the clipboard to one of his players in 1976 and saying, hey, go ahead and design what it is that we're going to do next. And I think that style of coaching was much more prevalent in the past. And now we've shifted it where players do have more of an input, that relationship between coach and player. And then you talked about how you learned that asking questions could be critical to helping develop insight for your clients. And I see the same thing when you talk about coaching basketball, where it's not the coach saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. It's the coach saying, hey, what did you see? Hey, what are you seeing? What could we do differently? And that deepens the understanding that a player has, or it could be a business person, whatever it may be. I think by asking the right questions, so often you get the person, whether again, that's the player, that's the client, that's the mentee, however you want to phrase it, that person gains more insight from answering the question and thinking through that, as opposed to someone just telling. It's just like a teacher that if you tell me something, great, I may remember it, but if I actually have to do it and be immersed in it, I get so much more value out of that than I do just somebody telling me the answer.
Yeah, Mike, let's riff on this for a minute, because this is something I love chatting about. So in my line of work, yes, there are tools, there are skills you can learn, but the human experience is really complex. So when I love to ask questions, it's not necessarily because, they're going to come up with the answer and that'll be stickier for them. My favorite questions are the ones that I legitimately don't have the answer to. And because I'm asking them about their perspective. And so my coaching is different than an athlete's sports coach, because a sports coach if you're asking them, hey, where should you have been on that set or that play, then you should know the answer, right? Your job as the coach is to know where they should be. And so that can be valuable. But if you think about transactional leadership and transformational leadership, I think a great coach knows when to be transactional and knows when to be transformative. A great teacher, and I'm curious to learn from you as far as what it's like to be in a classroom, because what do you teach in school, Mike?
So I've taught elementary school. Right now I'm teaching elementary phys ed for grades K to 6, but in the past in my career, I taught third grade for 4 years in a classroom setting, and then I taught fifth grade for about 14 years.
So awesome. So let's just stick with phys ed. There are going to be things that you can teach kids in a gym and that you know the answer to, and maybe you'll ask them a question so that it's stickier for them. All right, that's cool. That's solid. Then there are going to be things where you can model for them and show them, and kinesiology has proven a lot of research that modeling actually can help someone learn. So there is a time to give them the transactional feedback and just, hey, if you want to do this better, this is what you do. And a great sports coach has to do that. Like players want that. They want the knowledge, the information, the wisdom. That's really, really valuable. And then you have transformative, which I think is much more of an inside out experience. And those are the spaces in between games and practices. And the best coaches I've been around build relationships with their athletes outside of the court, outside of the field. And what they do in those instances is they bring them into their office. They ask them questions that they don't know the answer to, and they're learning about who that person is. And there was just a game, Sunday Night Football had the New England Patriots and the Seattle Seahawks. And if you think about Bill Belichick, he is more transactional in his approach with his guys. Do your job. I'm going to make sure you're in the right spot at the right time. Your job is to do your job. I don't think the Patriots are going to be talking about the next Supreme Court justice in their locker room. Pete Carroll, on the other end of the spectrum, on the other sideline, believes in transformative leadership. He always wants to bring out the best version of his guys. He wants to understand who they are, why they do what they do, and how we can bring out the very best of them. And by knowing who they are, we can put them into a position that allows them to thrive. And so it's not to say Bill Belichick, who's probably the best football coach of all time, isn't a great coach. He certainly is, and that works for him in football. And I think Nick Saban takes the same approach at the college level. So there is a formula that works in a transactional arena. For me, the people I'm driven to and the people I'm intrigued by are the ones that are more transformative. And what I love about sports is the potential for transformation. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to win. It doesn't mean I don't want to compete. It doesn't mean I don't care about winning and losing. But what I love about sports is when you see this human element, when you see this transformative element take place, and you see people grow and develop and learn about themselves. I think one of the amazing things about the NBA right now is you're seeing these guys play at such a high level and care deeply about humanity. And I really believe there's nothing to say that you can't do both of those. And I'm the type of person that believes you should have it all in this life. And so why not go after it? But I do think it's important for coaches to come up with their own style and understand, what is my style? Is it more of a transactional style? Is it more of a transformational style? Obviously, the level you're at also matters. Like if you're at high school level and it's all transactional, like I'm not so sure that that's the goal of high school athletics, not minimizing high school athletics. I live in Washington, D.C. We have the Catholic League in Washington, D.C., and you won't go to a more competitive basketball conference in the country. And that's why I've worked with those teams and seen them up close, and it is awesome. But their job is, even though a lot of those kids are going to play Division I basketball, a lot of those coaches' job is to teach life skills and to grow boys into men. And so I know I'm going off a little bit here, but I really love that concept of transactional leadership and transformational leadership, and having clarity around what your job is, how you can do it authentically, and so that you can be you. And as I said, Bill Belichick, Nick Saban, I think those guys are more transactional. I've worked with players that have played for those guys. So there's some evidence to back that up. And it doesn't mean they don't love their guys. Like at the end of the Super Bowl, and it seems like the Patriots are there every year, you always hear them mic'd up saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. So you can love somebody even if it's a little more transactional. But I find that stuff to be really intriguing, interesting for anyone who's in a leadership position, whether it's a teacher, a coach, or a CEO.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that if you're in a leadership role, that you should care more about than just the bottom line. It should be about impacting people. And I think you mentioned it when you talked about high school basketball. And I think in a lot of ways that the lower the level that you go, the more important that teaching of life skills becomes, because you think about each level in sports that you move up. So you start out, let's just say, with third graders playing basketball. Well, there's a lot of kids who are third graders that are playing basketball. By the time you get to sixth grade, some of them have dropped out. By the time you get to middle school, some more of them are gone. By the time you get to high school, even more are gone. So at each progressive level, more and more kids have dropped out. Well, if the only thing you taught them as a youth basketball coach or a middle school coach is how to shoot a layup or when to run this offense or how to play defense, then you're doing those kids a disservice, because you haven't had as much of an impact on them as you could had you been incorporating some life skills and some lessons that they can take beyond the basketball court. And to me, that's always been a theme that's kind of run through our podcast. It's one of the things that I've probably come around on a lot as a coach. And I've talked about it before that, when I started out coaching after I got done with my playing career, it was just, coaching was about me. It wasn't really about the players that I was coaching. And slowly over time, that shifted where you start to realize that, yeah, the game is important. Yeah, winning is important. Yeah, X's and O's are important. But really what's important is what's the impact that you're having on the kids that you're there to serve. And it's not just the impact that you have in the moment. It's the impact that you have 20 years from now when they come back to you or when they realize something that you said that made a difference in their life. And to me, when you talk about trying to get someone to perform at their best, yeah, you want them to perform at their best out on the floor, but you also want them to perform at their best in their life. And that can take a lot of different directions, as we know, for everybody. Not everybody ends up with a career as a professional athlete or a career in sports as a coach or whatever. We all end up in different walks of life. And so you want the people that are part of your organization, part of your team, to take something more away from it than just, hey, I learned the technical skills. There was also something that benefited me in all walks of life. And I think to me, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about transformational leadership.
Mike, there's two things that I want to pull on that you're talking about. Number one, I had a mission when I first started doing this work, which was help others enjoy success, therefore I'll enjoy success. And so when I first started doing this work, I was linking my success to my client's success. And that was really dangerous because, first of all, I was working with multiple teams, multiple athletes in multiple sports. There was a whole lot of losing, a whole lot of losing. Like sports, you're going to lose. Like there's just there's no way around it. Like maybe Floyd Mayweather doesn't lose. Maybe Usain Bolt doesn't lose. It's very rare that, if you're an athlete, you don't experience losing. So first of all, it was going to be a miserable existence if I linked my success to theirs. And second, I think the more that you get into coaching, the more you realize that you don't dunk a basketball, you don't shoot a three, you don't, defend. It's those guys. They're the ones that actually execute and do the work. And so I always love watching coaches after a championship and watch how much they credit their guys versus how much they talk about themselves. And it just is pretty telling to me. And I love watching coaches that almost take a step back and let the players celebrate and let them have that moment. And I think it's a recognition that this is their moment and they earned it. And it doesn't mean that coaching isn't valuable. Look, I'm a coach. You're a coach. I love it. I think it's an amazing profession and it can change lives. So I'm not devaluing it, but I think a great coach also understands that it's not about them. And so I really shifted my mission to helping others unlock potential and possibility so that they can enjoy success. And when I took myself out of it, A, I think it was healthier for me. And B, I think it was more truthful. It was more honest. It was really at the core of my beliefs. And then the last thing I'll say, the second thread, was we were talking about levels. And I think we make the mistake often in thinking that pro level is better than high school level and college level is better than high school and so on and so forth. And I've worked with a lot of high school sports teams and brilliant coaches at that level. And I've worked with pro and college. There's brilliant people everywhere at every level.
If you have an existing podcast or are looking to launch your own pod but aren't sure where to start, the team at My Podcast Manager can help. Our podcast team works behind the scenes so you can do what you do best. We'll help you launch your podcast, make it sound great, and free up your time for the more enjoyable parts of podcasting. If you're ready to put your podcast editing, production, and promotion on autopilot with a trusted team of podcasting professionals, visit mypodcastmanager.com to get started.
Let's take the Lakers out of its final four teams just because they have two of the top 5 best players in the world, and then somehow they've created a bench of just awesome dudes. Like, they're just loaded. So let's just take them out of it for a minute, and let's just use them as an outlier. But you look at the Nuggets, and you look at the Celtics, and you look at the Heat, and you've got Brad Stevens, Mike Malone, and Eric Spoelstra. And if you listen to what they are talking about at that level, it is transformational leadership. Malone's talking about working hard and playing with joy. Brad Stevens, who many thought would fail in the NBA because he wouldn't resonate with these guys, has always talked about character and the type of people we are. And you listen to Jaylen Brown or you listen to Jason Tatum, and those guys are just seemingly, from the outside looking in, incredible human beings. And then you go to the Heat, where I think it is remarkable what Spo has done. He has taken this group of competitive dudes, and they play with a chip on the shoulder. They play right on the edge, but it's clear that they value competition. It's clear that they're fearless, and it's clear that they care about each other. And oh, by the way, they're playing, a rookie and hero. They're Bam, who I think is in his second year, and they're giving these guys long leashes to go make an impact. And I think, from the outside looking in, I've always heard so much about Spo and how much he cares about his guys and how much he cares about the culture with the Heat. If you're around the NBA at all, you hear about it. And so as we're even having this conversation, I think it's important, no matter what level people are at, that they're intentional with how they're showing up for their players, because it matters. And if you want to cultivate relationships with your guys, which at the end of the day is at the heart and at the core of coaching, you got to be clear on what your value system is, what your mission is, what your philosophy is, what your vision is. And you have to be able to communicate that to your people. And then, oh, by the way, you have to be thoughtful about the guys that you bring in. I mean, Jimmy Butler bounced around, 3 teams and before landing in Miami. And it's pretty clear that he's in lockstep with Spo as far as what they want to do. And his way is probably not for everybody, but it's an alignment. And you can see that alignment, and you can see it in a guy like Jay Crowder. And so I think it's interesting because that's the highest level where talent is supreme. And look, the Lakers will probably win it all. And it matters when you've got 2 studs. And by the way, LeBron and Anthony Davis are also seemingly impressive humans as well. And so I just think the human element is really important. I'm not someone who minimizes talent. I think talent, you don't win anything without talent. And supreme talent is a game changer. I think no one's going to deny it. It seems like LeBron James and Anthony Davis are playing on 8-foot hoops. And they're just incredibly skilled, athletic basketball players that were born to play this. And they've worked their asses off to get to the level they're at. So I think that's a different beast. But those other 3 teams maxing out their potential, I don't think anyone's going to deny that the Nuggets, Celtics, and Heat are not maxing out their potential to get to where they are. And I think that's where the coach really plays a role.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because when you say that guys have tremendous talent, which we know that clearly LeBron, Anthony Davis, these are guys who are gifted beyond what any mortal human being could possibly expect. But when you look at athletes in the NBA, almost everyone is gifted in some way. That could be running and jumping. That could be eye-hand coordination. That could be size. That could be speed. It could be whatever, some combination of all those things. And yet, we all know that there are lots of players that are walking around that had at least equal, maybe physical talent, but never maximized that the way that guys who reach the highest level maximize it. I think of Michael Jordan, I think of LeBron, and I think of 2 guys who were again, tremendously gifted, had every single possible attribute that you could want as a basketball player. And yet, I think that what really set them apart is the things that they did to maximize that talent. And I think that's where some of the things that you do about talking about how someone becomes an elite performer, what they need to do in order to be able to perform at that elite level. There's a layer of preparation that they have to do. So I think this is a good time to talk a little bit about your book, which is coming out soon, called Shift Your Mind. And in the book, you talk about the difference between preparation and performance and how those two things are related. So why don't we dive into that, maybe just kind of framing it around what an elite basketball player or an elite basketball coach, what that might look like in terms of their preparation and their performance.
Man, you're good at segues. That was impressive. So I said I've been doing this work for about a decade, and I think it was like 2013, 2012, the New York Giants had just won the Super Bowl, and Tom Coughlin was being interviewed, and he said, yeah, we were humble in our preparation and we were confident in our performance. And I heard that, and I was like, man, that is clean. It is clear. That's really interesting. Like, humble and confident, they're kind of opposites. And what is that about? So I started working with my clients about what does it look like when you're humble in preparation? And then what does it look like when you're confident in performance? And I'm working with golfers, hockey players, basketball, soccer. I've always liked working with a diverse group of people, even though, don't tell anyone, I'm a basketball guy at my core. I love working with different sports. I love working with people outside of sports because I think when you can learn things that are not in your wheelhouse, you grow, you develop, and then you can bring that to those other places. So humble enough to prepare and confident enough to perform. And so we started making these lists when I'd work with these clients about how is their mindset for preparation different than their mindset for performance. And it didn't matter the sport. They would create these giant lists with me, and we would do it as an exercise in one of our meetings. And it got to a point where I had like 35 of these shifts in preparation and performance. And I'm sitting there seeing people tweet, stay humble, stay hungry, be selfless, don't try to be perfect. There are these sayings, be comfortable with the uncomfortable, don't fear failure. And I'm hearing all that, and I'm looking at our list, and I'm saying, well, people in their sports need some of this at different times. And when matters, like when we use fear matters, when we use humility matters, when we are perfectionistic matters. So I started writing, and I started to realize like this should be out there and this should be shared with more people. And as I started to work with my clients and they got clear on their shifts, they would then focus on a few of these so that when they were performing, they would be a certain way. When they were preparing, they'd be a different way. So the book is essentially 9 of those 30 plus shifts because we thought 30 would be a bit much. And some of the shifts are a little redundant, and some of the shifts didn't have enough research or evidence to make us feel good about putting it into a book. So the ones that we came up with, I'll just riff on them a little bit here, are humble in preparation and actually arrogant in performance. So I took what Tom Coughlin said and I actually ratcheted it up another level, and I'm happy to break that down at some point with you. We talk about work in preparation and play in performance. We talk about thinking about the future in preparation and then being present in performance, perfectionistic in preparation and adaptable in performance, using analysis in preparation and instinct in performance, experimenting in preparation, trying new things, and then trusting your process in performance, being uncomfortable in preparation and then being comfortable in performance, using fear in preparation and then being fearless in performance, and actually being selfish in preparation so that you can be selfless in performance. So those are the shifts, and happy to dive into any of those if there's one that you're like, man, I'm really curious about that.
All right. So here's one that jumps out at me, thinking at this from a perspective of our audience of coaches. And I'm looking at analysis versus instinct. So when I think of analysis as a coach, and I think of that being part of my preparation, I think about going in and designing my team's offensive and defensive systems. I think about the scouting that I'm going to do in preparation for a particular opponent. And I can come into that game completely prepared with a game plan to go against a specific opponent, or you think about the NBA playoffs, go in to a series with an idea of here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to attack this team, here's what we think they're going to do to us. And then on the performance side of it, when the game starts, the other team doesn't cooperate with your game plan, and they don't necessarily do the things that you thought they were going to do, and it doesn't always work out exactly the way you prepared for. So then you have a coach who needs to then rely on their instinct, their gut, what they're seeing in the moment. There's no time to go spend 20 minutes conferring with your assistants to figure out how are the Miami Heat stopping my best player, Giannis Antetokounmpo, from getting to the basket. What are they doing? I have to figure out in the moment, what do I need to do differently? So maybe talk about analysis versus instinct when it comes to coaching in your mind.
And Mike, as I was listening to you talk, there's also perfectionism and adaptability in your question as well. For
sure. Absolutely.
How do I adapt? And we always, people always say the best coaches find ways to adapt, make adjustments, whether it's a series or a halftime or quarter or timeout or whatever it might be. Let's go to analysis and instinct, though. So what do we mean by them? Let's use distinctions. Analysis to me is a detailed examination of the elements or structure of something. It's typically a basis for discussion or interpretation. We live in an analytics world today. Analytics is in sports. It's in companies. Anywhere you look, and analytics is great. It gives us more data, more information so that we can learn, we can grow, we can develop. But when we're performing, yes, analytics can help us. Who do we foul? Where's the spot that we want to get to on the floor? But to your point, a lot of times we are in a wicked environment when we're performing. We might have come up with this perfect game plan, but now we need to rely on our instinct to adapt. And so I'll tell you a quick story about that, which is I mentioned that I'm in Washington, D.C., and I had the pleasure right when I finished grad school to get linked up with Paul VI High School, which is in the Catholic League, which I mentioned earlier. And for those that don't know, the Washington Catholic League tends to have 5 teams that are vying for top 25 status in the country. So it's just a ridiculously competitive league. They send tons of Division I athletes to the college level every single year. And the coaches that coach on these teams, I'm telling you, are whatever level you want to appreciate in basketball, these guys can coach at that level. They are incredible. And so I was fortunate and lucky to get linked up with Glenn Farello, who's the head coach of Paul VI. And in 2011, 2012 season, they went on this magical run and went undefeated in the conference, which had never been done before. It was unheard of. They usually beat each other up. If you've heard of DeMatha, Gonzaga, Bishop O'Connell, St. John's, these are powerhouse basketball schools that they crush each other during the regular season. So Paul VI went on this magical run, and they had never won the Catholic League championship. So the finals are played at American University in a sold-out arena. It's just a really cool event and environment. To me, it's my favorite sporting event of the year at any level. And I'm sitting up behind the basket watching the girls team play first because I was also working with them at the time. And I'm watching them, and I watch Coach Farello come into the arena. And I see all these people grabbing at him and, trying to get his attention. And we link eyes. He comes up the bleachers, sits next to me, and I'm like, Coach, how you doing? He's like, honestly, Brian, my head is running 1,000,000 miles an hour. He was analyzing. He was thinking about all this different stuff. And he's like, I'm just not clear. And so we sat there on the bleachers in front of a sold out arena, and I had him close his eyes and count to 10. And all he did was just focus on the numbers. So he would go in his head, 1, 2, 3, 4, and he would just keep counting the numbers. And the rule of the game was if he had a thought pop into his head, any sort of analysis, he had to go back and start at 1. And I think he may have got it on the first or second try. He got to 10. He opened his eyes and he looked at me and he smiled. He's like, all right, I'm good. And it happens to be a fairy tale happy ending. They end up hitting ridiculous shots late in the game. Look, did any of that have to do with what we did? Probably not. But the point would be that he needed a shift away from analysis and more to trusting his instinct, which is his innate impulse, his inclination or tendency. And that's more of a gut feeling than a head feeling. And so, yes, coaches have to live in this space of analyzing and being in their head, and then at times go to their gut. And I think coach really has figured out how to do that, when to use analysis and then when to use his instinct and intuition. And a couple other examples of coaches doing that would be when the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl and they ran that play Philly, Philly, where they handed the ball off to the running back and Nick Foles went out for a pass. Nick Foles went to the sideline before they did that because they had a timeout and turned to his coach, Doug Peterson, and said, "Do you want to run Philly, Philly?" And he looked at him for a second. He's like, "Yeah, let's do it." And, in that moment, he trusted his intuition. It wasn't, what are the odds of this? What are the odds of that? He trusted his intuition. A few years earlier, Sean Payton ran an onside kick for the New Orleans Saints after halftime, and that helped propel them to the Super Bowl. So I think coaches often have to take chances and rely on intuition when the lights are on and when they're in moments that seemingly are counterintuitive. I'm always blown away by those coaches that in that moment can rely on intuition. So I love data. I love analytics, and greatness and championships and beauty and masterpieces often are a result of intuition, which, by the way, instinct is birthed from great analysis. You do the analysis and preparation, it actually allows you to step into instinct because you've already dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's, and looked at everything. I think similarly, perfectionism and adaptable work the same way. If I'm perfectionistic with everything that I do, and I know everything that they could run, what defense they run, if they like to press, if they like to go zone, if they ever will throw a box and one at our top player, best player, then I will know how to adjust and be adaptable in performance. The problem is when we bring our preparation mind into performance, or we bring our performance mind into preparation. So the issue with perfectionism is if you bring it into performance, it can be crippling. The issue with analysis is if you bring it into performance, you can have paralysis by analysis. And the same thing goes the other way. If you're just relying on intuition and instinct and preparation, you're not going to give it the detail that it deserves. And if you're just always adjusting and adapting in preparation, then you're not actually moving toward the excellence of perfectionism. So for me, these shifts are all about when. And the last thing I'll say is a great practice. So for the coaches that are listening, I'm sure you know that a great practice involves times when your guys are in the performance mind, they're competing, they're focused on executing, they're actually practicing what it's like to have time and score. And there's a time to actually work on our craft to grow and develop, whether it's watching film or working on our footwork or working on a new move or working on a Euro step, whatever it might be. So a great practice will blend the preparation mind and the performance mind.
All right. So I want to follow up with that by asking you, how does or where does the ability to perform under pressure or in the clutch, where does that fit into this? I know we oftentimes don't think of coaches as having to perform in the clutch under pressure, but so often they do. You have a timeout with 10 seconds to go, and both coaches got to figure out what they're going to do in that 1 minute time frame. There's not many of us in life who have to make an important decision, and we're given 1 minute, A, to make the decision, and then 2, communicate that decision to a bunch of other human beings and try to get them to execute that. So maybe talk about the ability to perform under pressure, both from a coaching perspective, and then you can also touch on it maybe as a player, from a player perspective as well.
I think about what choking is, because that's sort of the opposite of performing in the clutch.
Absolutely.
And it usually is about anxiety. It's about thinking about the future. It's about focusing too much on the potential outcome and losing your presence and coming out of the present. So we talk about staying in the now or being where your feet are or being present. What I was doing with Glenn as he walked into that arena, that was the biggest game of his career. He had never won that championship. It was packed. He was playing against DeMatha, who had, Jeremy Grant, who's now playing for the Denver Nuggets, and had a bunch of other guys who went on to play. And one guy played at NC State, one guy played at Pitt. They were loaded. And so was his team, by the way. And they're super talented as well. But he was getting too far ahead and needed to ground himself in the present. So that's easier said than done. But breathing and mindfulness and meditation are great tools to help someone learn how to handle the present moment and therefore lock into performing in the clutch. I think if you study this stuff, you'll realize that most high performers, they perform well in the clutch because they're not thinking about it as any different than when they're shooting on a blacktop or in a gym that's empty. It's they trust in their own competence and their ability to do the job, and they're not overthinking. So that analysis can really get in the way when we're performing, and that's what can cause us to choke, which is why we need to step into our gut, into the present, and think less about the future. Anxiety is typically about ruminating about the future. So if you're around someone who's overly anxious, if you listen to them, they're often talking about a fear or a worry or a concern about the future. So I think for a coach, it's no different. They spend so much time strategizing. A great coach is thinking about leading. They're thinking about strategizing. A lot of their job is about the future. And it's a chess match, right? And they're trying to think about what's the guy going to do next. But ultimately, when it's time to actually execute, they need to be present. And so I think the difference between a coach and a player, and if you have any thoughts on this, you can let me know because you played at a high level and you've coached for a while now. I think a player just needs to really focus on executing for most of the time, whereas a coach needs to think about strategy. And I think leadership is no different. A leader needs to think about strategy most of the time. There does come a time where a CEO or a head coach needs to move away from strategy and just focus on execution. So when they're drawing up that last play, it's not as much a chess match anymore. Now it's more checkers. It's like, this is what we need to draw up and this is what we need to do. And in that moment, they need to be much more present than they need to be future focused. And look, coaching basketball is hard. I've seen it up close. Like, I don't envy that job because I think you have to toggle between thinking about the future and what you're trying to do and focus on the present and what your team needs right now. And I think a great coach will understand when they need to be in more of a preparation mind and when they need to be in more of a performance mind.
Yeah, I look at it from a standpoint, I think both as a player and as a coach, sort of in the same way, in that I think the people who perform the best in the clutch are people who are able to narrow that focus down and figure out what's important in the given moment. Because I think as a player, you can get caught up in, as you said, thinking about what are the ramifications of if I miss this shot or if the other team scores or we don't win this game. Instead of, as a player, I think it's really important to just say, look, I need to get this done. Here's what I need to do in this moment on this play to make sure that the outcome is a good one. And obviously we all know that it doesn't always work out that way, but I think the best players are able to really dial in on here's what I need to do in this moment and block out all the other things that are going on around them. And I think from a coaching standpoint, I know one of the things that I've always struggled with is, okay, you call a timeout and maybe you have 17 things that you've seen that you'd like to be able to convey to your team. Because, boy, if we just made these 5 adjustments, everything would start going really well. But if you talk to them and you say 5 different things, they're going to remember 0 of those things. So you as a coach, in the moment, you have to be able to narrow your focus and say, what is the most important thing that I need to get across to my team in order to make sure that they execute and do what we need to do in order to win this play, win this game, win this moment, whatever it might be. And so to me, I've always found that the ability to narrow your focus in the moment to what's really most important when it's a big moment, when you're under a time constraint, I think that ability to narrow focus to me is what always stands out and what always separates the people who are the best players and the best coaches.
I really like that. I think that's really cool. And I think about what focus is. So simple definition for focus is that it's directed attention. So if you start there, because the word focus, coaches tell us to focus, teachers, parents, they all say focus, focus, focus. Well, what do you want me to focus on? And so I love using directed attention. Hey, let's direct our attention to the baseline, or let's direct our attention to the huddle, or let's direct our attention to the ball. And then the second thing I think of are that there's different elements of directing attention. So use that term narrow. We can be internal narrow, which is the one thing that I think you're focused on. Like, hey, what's this one thing? It's an internal dialogue you're having with yourself, and you're trying to narrow it in. Then you have external narrow, which is if a shooter is just focused on the back of the rim, they're just focused on a target. Then there's external broad, which is a great point guard is going to be seeing the whole floor and knowing where guys are so that he can make a pass. You watch Rondo right now. He's in that external narrow mode. And then you've got sort of Internal broad is the other one we haven't hit on. So internal broad, internal narrow, external broad. And internal broad is really a lot of thoughts, a lot of thinking. It's where a lot of strategy lives. But in the moment, that internal broad thinking can often get in the way of us performing under pressure because it's too much and it's an overload of information. And that's where we can potentially choke, is in that internal broad space. I interviewed Hakeem Warwick for my podcast, and people always remember Hakeem for the block that he had in the finals for Syracuse. I happened to be in the arena. I went to Syracuse, and I was a freshman, so that was a fun moment for me. And so they remember his block, but what they forget is that he missed 2 free throws before that block that could have really put the game away. And I asked Hakeem what was he thinking when he was at the free throw line, and he said my mind was just running 1,000,000 miles an hour. And I was thinking about all these different things, and I was not narrow in my focus. I was not either focused on the rim or focused on the one thing like you're talking about. And that's why we talk about routines at the free throw line, because it narrows our focus. So when we have a close-ended action like a free throw and there's no defense coming at us, we really want to be narrow in our approach. Or if you're designing a play, that's a great time to really narrow in your approach. And I think he then shifted his attention after he missed the second free throw to coming back and really became external with his focus. And that's how he realized that there was a guy in the corner, and then he could extend his long arms and get a block that could change the course of history in college basketball. So I think the idea of shifting your attention is really important. And to your point, I think it's really important for athletes or any performer to be aware of what do they need to be when they're, in high, rugged, intense situations as far as where they're directing their attention. And if you notice that you're being very internally broad, is there something you can do to narrow that focus and come back to either one word or clapping your hands or snapping your fingers to get you back to that present moment and back to more of a narrow focus?
So I think of that as being, I've heard it called a mistake ritual, where you do something wrong, you make a mistake in a game, and you have some way of wiping that away. It could be something physical that you do. Maybe you just pretend to wipe the sweat off your brow, or it could be, as you mentioned, a word that you take and put it away. You might just say, flush it, and then that gets you to move on mentally so you're ready for the next play. To me, I think that's something that is really, really important. It goes to another one of the shifts that you talk about in the book, which is shifting in preparation, where you're focused on the future, to your performance. You have to be focused on the present. And when you talked about Hakeem Warwick missing 2 free throws, or you think about guys who are great free throw shooters, I think that they're able to, like you said, they're able to block out all those other distractions, just focus on that task that they're able to do. And they put that routine in place, and it allows them to just sort of be there in the moment, doing what they've always done over and over again. And it's the people who kind of overthink it. And I think once it gets into your head, it becomes very difficult to overcome that if you allow those other thoughts to come into your mind. So just talk maybe a little bit about how important it is to play present, for lack of a better way of saying it.
It's so interesting. I was sitting next to 2 NBA players, and they were talking about going to Toronto for a game. And they were both big. So one was a power forward, one was a center. And I think the center shot 80% from the free throw line, and the power forward shot maybe 60% from the free throw line in his career. And they were talking about going to Toronto, and Toronto has this super fan that sits on the baseline and throws a towel up in the air when guys are shooting free throws. And the power forward was talking to the center, the 60% guy talking to the 80% guy, and was saying, yeah, that guy always distracts me. And the center goes,
who?
What guy?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was absolutely.
And by the way, the power forward was an amazing passer. Like he would, like those LeBron skip passes. And I think one of the things that basketball people have so much respect for LeBron is his vision.
For sure.
This guy was one of the few guys in the league that could make those types of passes. And the center could not. The center was a guy who just did his job, sort of a journeyman center that, would just, do the little things. And so just there are gifts in everything, and there are curses in everything. And that's why I think it's so important to know when to use something and when not to use something, because we all have superpowers. And if our superpower is used in the wrong way, it can really hinder us. And so that player who struggled from the free throw line, was great at seeing the floor and making passes that other people couldn't see. I think of a guy like Jason Kidd, and one of the amazing things about Kidd was he always had that external broad vision. And then later in his career, he became a great shooter. And it was clear that he was able to narrow his focus and change his game. It was a really cool element of him. So at any rate, look, I think focusing on the future gets a bad rap. I think we often say be present, but we have to think about our future. We have to envision where we want to go and what we want to be. And often that future vision drives us, motivates us, helps us think of our legacy and what we want to do. But when we're performing, playing present is huge. And that's often, to your point, what allows us to get back there is a mistake response, whether it's clapping our hands, snapping our fingers, or having a place in the arena that we can look to reset. But also training the present it's a skill. I mean, meditation and mindfulness has become very popular. When you see the best player in the world doing it in LeBron James, you don't really have an excuse not to develop some sort of practice. And I think meditation can look very different for different people. It can be breathing silently in a room, but it also can be just going for a walk and noticing everything that you see. If you're in college and you're on a quad, just take in the buildings, take in the architecture. If you're in a high school, like just take some time throughout your day to notice what's going on in the hallways and just observe. And that's really what allows us to ground ourselves in the present. And then the present doesn't seem so overwhelming because we're able to sit in it and we're not so scared of any ruminating thoughts because we know that they're just thoughts or feelings or just feelings, and we're able to ground ourselves to where we are.
Yeah, I think one of the things that always comes to mind, and I've talked to this point with other coaches, is it's really important, I think, to be, and when I think of meditation and mindfulness, I think of the word intentional. You have to be intentional with your thoughts and with what you're doing. And so often in today's world, we go a million miles an hour all the time. And I know I'm as guilty of this as anybody. And I've read so many things, especially recently, just about people recommending, authors recommending, people who are successful recommending, take 5 minutes out of your day, take 15 minutes out of your day, take an hour out of your week and just sit and think and be alone with your thoughts. And to me, I've started to try to do that. And I really feel like it's helping me to sort of clarify where I am with all the things that I'm trying to do. And I'm sure whether you're an athlete or a coach, that intentionality and that ability to slow yourself down can have a huge impact positively on your performance.
The research around mindfulness is pretty profound. It's shown to help with attention regulation, which is what we've been spending the last, 20 minutes talking about, body awareness, emotional regulation, including like being able to reappraise exposure or anxiety, change in our perspective of ourself and building self-awareness. So there's some pretty cool research around what it does to the brain and how it impacts us. So I think I'm a fan of it. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all approach. I think too often people are saying, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way. And if you ask any meditation guru, they'll say that there is no way. And
right.
I think the biggest, people have different ways of going about doing it. I think it's just important, especially with technology and things vibrating and getting our attention and designed to make us addicted. I think that's become abundantly clear. It's important to have some space to just be. And in that being space is often where great performance lies. So,
No question. All right, Brian, we are coming up against our time limit. So I want to give you an opportunity to share with people where they can find out more about Strong Skills, where they can find out about your book, Shift Your Mind. Give us the rundown on where people can learn more about you and all the great things that you're doing.
So Strong Skills is the company. It's www.strongskills.co. We decided not to get the M at the end of that. It was expensive, and I just didn't think it was worth it to pay for the M. I'm
Understood.
Like, this ain't worth it. This M is not worth that much. There are 25 other letters in the alphabet, or we don't even need another letter there. So it's strongskills.co, and there you can see everything that we're up to. And then I'm a big Twitter guy. I'm at Brian Levenson, and my podcast is called Intentional Performers. So the fact that you talked about being intentional resonates with me, and it's one of the things I've noticed when I interview different people is how intentional they are. And you mentioned the book earlier, really excited about it. It's called Shift Your Mind. It's available now wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any indie bookstore should have it as well. I'm really excited about the book. Spent 4 years working on it, had to practice these shifts. I had to practice being perfectionistic in preparation and adaptable, humble in preparation and arrogant in performance. So it was a real labor of love. I can't say it was easy, but I think it was worth it. And I'm excited to share it with everyone, and just grateful for you giving me some space to riff with you. I feel like we could go for another hour, and looking forward to learning more about you and what you guys are up to and what you all do with your camps, and just excited to get to know you a little better in the coming years.
Absolutely, Brian. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to this morning out of your schedule to jump on with us. And I agree with you 100%. We've gone for an hour and I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I get so many questions bubbling around in my brain that I'd like to ask you. So we'll have to make sure that we get an opportunity to do this again. But to everyone out there, we appreciate you jumping on with us this morning and listening to our conversation with Brian Levenson. And we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Hoop Heads podcast, presented by Head Start Basketball.